In a limestone cave in southern Spain, archaeologists found something that made them stop digging and start questioning everything they thought they knew about human survival. Scattered across the cave floor were bones, human bones. But they weren't buried. They weren't arranged with any kind of ritual care. They were broken, scraped, and marked with cuts that perfectly matched the marks found on deer bones in the same layer of earth. The same tools, the same technique, the same purpose. Someone had butchered these people the exact same way they butchered animals. At first, the scientists thought it might be violence, a massacre, maybe even a ritual killing tied to some forgotten belief. But the cut marks told a different story. They weren't the marks of rage or warfare. They were precise, efficient, the kind of marks left behind when someone is trying to get every last piece of usable meat off a bone before the cold takes it away. This wasn't an isolated incident either. Similar evidence has turned up across Europe, in caves dating back tens of thousands of years, right in the heart of the Ice Age. And that's when researchers were forced to ask a question that feels almost too uncomfortable to say out loud. Did our ancestors eat each other to survive? And if they did, what does that tell us about how close humanity actually came to disappearing completely? To understand why this happened, you have to understand what the Ice Age actually was. Not the cartoon version, not the cute woolly mammoth and a saber-toothed squirrel chasing an acorn. The real Ice Age was a slow-motion catastrophe that lasted for thousands of years. And it didn't just make the world cold, it made the world hostile to anything that needed to eat regularly to stay alive. Massive ice sheets, some over a mile thick, crept down across the northern hemisphere. Sea levels dropped. Forests that once fed entire populations of animals turned into frozen grasslands or disappeared completely. Temperatures in parts of Europe dropped so low that for months at a time, nothing grew. Nothing, no fruit, no roots, no leafy plants to forage. For early humans, this meant one brutal truth. If you couldn't hunt, you didn't eat. And if you didn't eat for too long, you didn't survive. This is where the big question starts to take shape. Humans are not built like bears. We can't hibernate. We can't store fat reserves that last through 6 months of frozen wasteland. Our bodies need a steady, constant intake of calories, especially fat and protein, just to keep our brains functioning. And the human brain is an incredibly expensive organ to run. It burns through energy faster than almost any other tissue in the body. So picture this. You're a small group of hunter-gatherers, maybe 20 or 30 people, trapped in a valley during a brutal winter stretch. The herds you depend on have moved on, following warmer patches of land that no longer exist nearby. The plants are frozen, the rivers are ice. Days pass, then a week, then 2 weeks without a successful hunt. What happens to a human body when it doesn't get enough food for that long? It starts shutting down non-essential functions. Muscle tissue breaks down for energy. The immune system weakens. Cognitive function drops. People become slower, weaker, more confused, more desperate. This is the edge that some Ice Age communities were forced to live on again and again for generation after generation. And that raises an unsettling possibility. When a group reaches that breaking point, when starvation becomes a more immediate threat than anything else, what decisions become possible that wouldn't be possible in any other circumstance? This is where the investigation gets uncomfortable, because the evidence doesn't just suggest occasional desperation. It suggests something far more structured. The first thing researchers had to figure out was whether these cut marks actually meant cannibalism or whether they meant something else entirely. Because in archaeology, jumping to the most shocking conclusion is usually a mistake. Scientists are trained to rule out every other explanation first. So they asked, could this be a burial ritual? Some ancient cultures did practice forms of secondary burial, where bodies were defleshed before being placed in a final resting spot. That would explain cut marks without requiring anyone to actually eat the flesh. But there was a problem. The marks on these bones weren't placed where you'd expect for a ritual cleaning. They were concentrated exactly where the most meat would be, along the limb bones, near the joints. In the same spots, butchers today would target on a deer or a goat to maximize the meat removed. And just as telling, the bones showed something else, evidence of marrow extraction. The long bones had been deliberately cracked open, the same way animal bones were cracked open elsewhere in the same cave layer, to get at the fatty, calorie-dense marrow hidden inside. Marrow isn't just a snack. In a starving body, marrow fat can be one of the most valuable sources of energy available. It's calorie-dense in a way that lean meat simply isn't. If you are dying of starvation, lean muscle alone won't save you. You need fat. So the ritual explanation didn't hold up. The pattern matched survival butchery, not ceremony. But that answer immediately created a new question. If this was about survival, was it really cannibalism in the way we imagine it? Were these communities killing each other for food, or is there a more complicated story hiding underneath? This is where the evidence gets stranger. In several sites, researchers found something unexpected mixed in with the human remains: the bones of the people's own family members. Not strangers, not enemies from a rival group. In some cases, genetic analysis suggested close biological relationships between the butchered individuals and others found in the same settlement. That detail changes everything, because it suggests this wasn't typically about violence between hostile groups raiding each other for meat. In many cases, it looks like communities were consuming members of their own group after they had already died. And that distinction matters enormously. There is a massive difference between killing someone for food and choosing not to waste the body of someone who has already died from starvation, illness, or the brutal conditions of an Ice Age winter. Suddenly, the picture starts to look less like horror and more like devastating practicality. If a member of your group died and your entire band was facing slow starvation, every calorie mattered. Letting a dead body simply decompose while children in your group were wasting away might not have been a choice anyone could afford to make. But this created another mystery. If this was purely about survival necessity, why does the evidence show up so often, across so many different sites and across thousands of years? If cannibalism was only an emergency measure taken in the worst possible moments, we would expect to see it rarely. Instead, archaeologists kept finding it again and again. In different caves, different regions, different time periods of the Ice Age, Spain, France, some sites in Northern Europe. The pattern wasn't rare, it was recurring. And that's where things get strange. Some researchers began to suspect that what they were looking at wasn't just a desperate one-time response to starvation. It might have been something closer to an embedded survival strategy. A grim but rational part of how some Ice Age communities managed extreme scarcity, almost like a contingency plan baked into the culture itself, passed down the same way fire-making or tool-making knowledge was passed down. That idea is unsettling because it suggests these weren't communities collapsing into chaos and desperation in their final moments. It suggests calculated decision-making, groups that had at some point faced this horror before and built rules around it. Maybe rules about who could be consumed and under what circumstances. Maybe taboos about consuming close family, balanced against the brutal math of keeping the group alive. But this also raised a much darker possibility that scientists couldn't ignore. If some groups had normalized this practice as a response to starvation, had any of them gone further? Had hunger ever pushed people to see other living humans, not just the already deceased, as a source of food? The discovery came from a cave in northern Spain where bones showed something the earlier sites didn't. Cut marks, not just on adults, but on the bones of children. And not just butchery marks. Marks consistent with the bones being processed almost immediately after death, with none of the weathering you'd expect if a body had been left exposed for even a few days before being used. That detail mattered. It suggested speed. And speed raised an uncomfortable question. Were people simply running out of time to wait for natural death? Researchers cross-checked this against something else, isotope analysis, which reveals what an individual ate in the final months of their life. In several of these cases, the chemical signatures showed signs of prolonged malnutrition before death. Not sudden death from violence, slow grinding starvation. So the evidence didn't point to murder. It pointed to something almost more tragic. Entire family groups starving together, with death arriving in sequence rather than all at once. And the living using whatever was left of the dead to buy a few more days of survival for the children, the strongest hunters, anyone still capable of finding the group's way back to food. This is the twist that changed how scientists understood the whole picture. This wasn't random horror. It wasn't even really cannibalism in the way pop culture imagines it, as some savage choice. It was something closer to a last desperate act of triage, performed by people who were, in every other way, exactly like us. People who loved their children. People who almost certainly grieved. People who made a choice that modern minds recoil from, because the alternative was watching everyone die. And that brings us to the final reveal. Why did this happen specifically during the Ice Age, and not just randomly throughout human history? Because the Ice Age created a perfect trap. Long stretches without food, no alternative crops to fall back on. No stored grain, no neighboring farms to trade with. Just small, isolated bands, sometimes completely cut off by snow and ice for months, with nothing standing between them and starvation except the animals they could find, and, in the worst moments, each other. This wasn't a sign of savagery. It was a sign of how thin the line was between human survival and human extinction. Every fire kept burning, every meal found, every brutal decision made in the dark of an Ice Age winter is the reason any of us exist to ask these questions at all. We like to think of our ancestors as primitive, distant, almost a different species emotionally. But the truth this evidence reveals is more unsettling and more human. They weren't choosing horror. They were choosing survival in a world that gave them almost nothing else to choose from. And maybe that's the real legacy of the Ice Age. Not the mammoths, not the ice sheets, but the proof that humanity's existence today was never guaranteed. It was earned generation after generation through choices our comfortable modern minds can barely imagine making. The mammoths died, the ice melted, but humanity survived. Because some people made choices we dare not even imagine.